thank all of you for coming to this. I know that this talk on brain-computer interfaces is a little bit on the fringe of what you're going to get at this conference. I know most or maybe all of you are software engineers. But I think that you will find this very interesting and relevant in the future of the work that you are all doing. And as a token of gratitude to all of you for coming to this, I will give you lots of cool GIFs or GIFs if you like. Hopefully some big questions that you can take home and we'll be thinking about for hopefully the next few years. And in a moment we'll have a shared moment of nostalgia, so hopefully that will be a good way to end the conference for everyone. So yes, as mentioned, I have a YouTube channel called the BCI Guy. So if you're, and BCI is short for brain-computer interface. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, there's my little plug for that. I do business development work at a company called BlackRock Neurotech. Who in this room was here for Scott's presentation earlier? Just so I can see. A few of you, okay. So yeah, Scott has an implant that our company created. He controls a neuroprosthetic device through that. I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. So we make brain implants similar to Neuralink. And then yes, as we talk about, a lot of these issues are, have deep ethical implications, and so that's some of the work that I'm doing as well. Okay, so I promised a moment of nostalgia and hopefully some good memories. So I invite all of you to think back to the first time, the first computer that you had, or the first significant memory that you remember working on a computer. And so I want you to transport yourself to that moment. Where were you? What was the environment you were using? What software did you use on that computer? What made you frustrated about it? What was exciting? And I just want to give you a moment to think about that and try to transport yourself to that time. Because I know all of us being interested in technology, hopefully that was a good seminal memory. And so now that you've all been in that mental space, I want you to now think about how you interact with your technology now and what type of computer you have, what that environment looks like, and where you work when you are using it. And I want you to think about what is different and what is the same. Because of course, there has been a tremendous amount of innovation over the last several decades, every year. But there are a few things that I would imagine have stayed mostly the same in the entire time that you've all been interacting with technology. And yes, I am picking some of the oldest examples that I can find here. But these three technologies, the ways that we interface with computers, have largely stayed the same. Probably in terms of, well, since we've been using computers. So we're looking at a two-dimensional screen, mostly using our sense of vision. Yes, a little bit of audio, certainly with speakers, but for the most part, we're just getting that sense of vision. We're typing on a keyboard and using a mouse. And these are third degree and second degree actions, where let's say we want to click something on a screen. We know that we need to move the cursor over there, and then we also have to move our arm to that cursor. And so this is something that has to be learned. It's not really intuitive. I know that it's worked well for us over the last several decades, but it's something that needs to be learned, and the bandwidth is pretty low for the amount of information and actions that we can take. And we've noticed in recent years that there are interfaces that are changing to address this. The touchscreen takes out one of those degrees, one of those things that you have to do, where instead of moving a mouse to translate to click on something, now you can just tap it when you're using a touchscreen. So that is a lot more intuitive for people that are just starting with computers. We now have 3D manipulation, which is interesting. It's more closely aligned to our original state, humans walking around in a 3D space, not sitting down at a desk. We can walk around, we can manipulate objects in 3D. I think that 3D design is a particularly compelling way to use VR. And I'm very interested in simulated interfaces as well. We see a Wii controller and a steering wheel for Mario Kart. And of course, that is a little bit more immersive, a little bit more true to life than flicking a joystick back and forth, which is the other option. And now we're starting to see a lot of development in the wearable space. So again, pointing to VR. Smartwatches as well, technology that we're carrying with us all the time. I would say that a smartphone is kind of a wearable as well, in that it's a computer that we take around with us everywhere. And so I want to point that out because we're watching as technology moves closer and closer to our bodies and becomes more and more intuitive, representing devices or representing objects in our normal life as we walk around. And so that takes us to the logical pinnacle of human-computer interaction, which is to go directly to the brain, to go to the organ that is responsible for everything that we perceive, that we feel, that we think. And that organ, of course, is generating the actions that we use to interact with our technology. And so theoretically, if we can interface directly with the brain, we can have the highest bandwidth of data exchange between our technology and between us as individuals possible. And I'll show you several examples about what is already possible, and then we'll talk together about what future interfaces might look like that are connected directly to the brain. So who here has heard of Neuralink? Just get a show of hands. Wow, pretty much all of you. So Neuralink is Elon Musk's brain-computer interface company. And very recently, in March, just a couple weeks ago, they showed their first demonstration in their first human subject, Nolan. That's who you can see in this video here. They showed this in a live stream on X. And I will play a little video. We can see what he's doing. But he was using his brain implant to control a cursor on a screen just using his mind. And one thing that he's always wanted to be able to do, he's paralyzed from the neck down, so he's unable to use a computer otherwise, unable to move his body. But he is a lover of chess, and this is his favorite application to use the device for, is to play chess online against some of his friends. And it's very difficult to see this because it was a live stream. I'll have better examples for you after. But he's able to move that cursor around very quickly with a high degree of accuracy compared to how we could all use a cursor with a mouse. And so he'll do other things like pause a song on Spotify, showing how accurate this device is. He also talks about that he was able to use this device for 8 hours. It is fully implanted. It's invisible from the outside. It uses Bluetooth to transmit information. And it can go for about 8 hours on a charge. And then there's a wireless charger that just kind of sits on top of his head to charge the device. Okay, so I want to give some foundational neuroscience knowledge before we go through, just so you can have a general understanding of some of the differences between our brains and computers and what underlying science allows us to develop these interfaces. So the neuron is the functional unit of the brain. This is the cell that is actually carrying signal, and it's also deciding whether or not to activate. So activation of a neuron, when it turns off, that is either on or off, similar to ones and zeros on a computer. But the decision to fire is very, very complex. So we have over on the left-hand side these extrusions here that we call neurites. They reach out and they receive signals from other neurons. And there can be up to 10,000 of these extensions that reach out and connect to other neurons. They're all collecting signals. Some neurons may be saying that it should activate. Some may say that it shouldn't activate. And based on that, it has to make a decision in the cell body, which we also call the soma, whether or not to send an action potential, which is that activation. And so here's some images of some real neurons. So you can see the dendrites coming out here. We have a single axon that comes out of every neuron that will then go and connect to other neurons and the cell bodies that are making that decision. And then here I just want to show a very, very brief example of a real neural network in neurons. And so what we're looking at here, what's important, is that they connect to each other at different levels. They may send very long wires, very long axons out, or they may be very short, and where you have these inhibitory interneurons. And so what that might do is connect to create a clock, to create small circuits, so that these neurons can modulate themselves and do computations within a small space. And so this is also very important. If you have a lot of activation of one neuron, it might want to to shut itself down so that it doesn't get injured. But this is important for our purposes because it allows us to selectively stimulate either the small ones that are inhibiting, that are slowing down movement, or the neurons that are excitatory, that are sending signals to broader areas of the brain. And by choosing which ones to target, we can both learn what the brain is trying to do, and we can also stimulate it to cause the brain to do certain things that we want it to do, i.e. send information to the brain. And here are just a few beautiful images that I wanted to put in here of our brains. Each of these little dots here, that would be the cell body, and then you can just see the wires that are extending out. And so I just like to include these images to show how beautiful the brains, how beautiful our brains are, and it's remarkable that we each have one of these supercomputers in our brain that we don't think about all the time. So to interact with the brain, we need to both record, which we can think of as reading signals from the brain, and write to the brain, stimulate. So these are those individual activations of a neuron. You have to be very close to that neuron to get such clear information like this. But when we have lots and lots of information and we know what individual neurons do, we can start to use that to control systems. And of course, there are many, many different types of neurotechnologies. Some of them sit on our scalp, which is great because they don't require surgery, but they're very far, comparatively to these other interfaces, they're very far from the neurons, and so their spatial resolution is low, meaning that they are getting aggregated information, broad information into what the brain is doing, versus something like this up here, a penetrating array that's actually going into brain tissue that can listen to individual neurons. So we're going from individual neurons, the farther you go out, now we're talking about the smallest discernible units as millions of neurons. And we'll see why that's important in a little bit. And then here's just another example of where interfaces might be. So again, we have EEG, which is sitting on the scalp. That's the most accessible type. And then there are many types of implants that go deeper into the brain to get that higher quality signal. So one thing that's important to mention, if you take your fingers and you put if you take two fingers, your index and middle finger, and you put them just above your ear, your middle finger, the one closer to the front of you, is going to be over your primary motor cortex. And this is the area of the brain that's going to be sending signals out to tell your muscles to move and where you want them to move. And one of the great things for neurotechnologists about this is that this area is very well mapped and on a broad scale consistent between people. So we can see this map. It's a little bit unsettling, but we can see this map over here that shows us along this motor cortex where each of our limbs and body parts resides, where those muscles are controlled from. And so if we want to create a prosthetic arm, a robotic arm, that can move its fingers, that can move its hand, and move the arm around, we're going to target those areas of the brain that are responsible for that control. And so this is just a really nice map to help us figure out where we want to place those implants. There are lots of implants out there. These are just a few of the most prominent ones that have all different ways of interfacing with the brain. The two biggest ones are BlackRock Neurotech's Utah array that's been in just about 40 people now, and then Neuralink's, which had their first implantation 2 months ago. So just so that you can see an up-close image of this, I know it looks a little bit scary, but we need those electrodes to be able to get deep into brain tissue. These have 96 channels per array, and you can have multiple of them. And the longest one has lasted a little over 9 years. And then this is Neuralink's device. I mentioned that it's completely invisible from the outside. This little quarter-sized object fits into your skull. It replaces a chunk of your skull. And then it has 8,000 to 10,000 of these electrodes which are inserted into your brain. And these are all individual threads. And the reason why you might want that is because our brains slosh around in our skulls. And having a rigid implant can cause some issues with that. So this is an interesting approach. Now, I showed you before the example from Neuralink, what Noland was doing, controlling a cursor. This is actually something that we've been able to do for a very long time. So this video is back in 2004, and we can see that Matt Nagel, the person in this video, is able to move this cursor around to different targets. He's playing Pong in that example, and he's able to use a computer typing on an on-screen keyboard and moving that cursor around. Here's another typing example that's a little bit more modern. I will show a few different versions of this, but the fastest one can type at 90 characters per minute, which is exceptional, at above 90% accuracy. And so just to give us an idea of how big of an improvement this is, Stephen Hawking used to write entire books able to only type 1 to 3 characters per minute. Characters, not words. And so if he had access to one of these devices, I mean, we can only imagine what he would have been able to do with that. So there are a few other examples here. This is just showing someone that's able to type on a keyboard and search the web. This was just connected to a stock Android tablet. And one more that's kind of interesting in this vein is some researchers from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute at Stanford were able to detect imagined handwriting. So what that ended up looking like is this is the data that was received from the interface, and this is actually where that data comes from that I have in the bottom. This is the pinnacle with 90 characters per minute at 99% accuracy. And so these letters that we're seeing was decoded entirely from thought. And 90 characters per minute is exceptional. I'm not even sure I can write letters that quickly with it. I don't think I can write 90 characters in 1 minute. So really amazing for this. And these devices are developed right now as medical devices for people who are paralyzed from the neck down or may have ALS or other movement disorders. And if you can imagine yourself in that situation, there are very few things that individuals that are in locked-in states are able to do. And being able to have access to a computer allows people to work again. And in some cases where people cannot speak at all, it allows them to communicate with loved ones, to advocate for themselves. I mean, you can just imagine how difficult it would be to be trapped in your body, unable to communicate with the outside world. And in my undergrad, I was doing some research with non-invasive text methods. And I went to a local nursing home and spoke to some individuals there, spoke to some caregivers. And there was one woman who wanted us to develop a device for her sister who had ALS and hadn't been able to speak in 3 years. And so we put together a device that has been created many times. There were open source files. And we gave her this device, and the first thing that she typed was, "My caregiver is too rough with me." And that sits with me all the time. That is a devastating first thing to hear from someone that hasn't been able to speak in several years, but it shows us the power of this technology and why it's needed in these environments. So we also have, if you saw Scott's talk, you saw some newer versions of this, but prosthetic robotic arms that are controlled entirely through thought, just by imagining that that arm is your own. Here's an example of dual arm control at the same time. And in this instance, he has a fork and knife hooked up. He's cutting himself a slice of bread. But when they put the hands on, he's actually able to feel through those prosthetic arms a sense of touch by sending stimulation back to his brain. This is an example of one of my friends, Ian Burkhart. Same idea, where he has a brain implant that is reading his neural activity in motor cortex. But you can see he has these bracelet-type things on his arm. And what that's actually doing is sending stimulation to his arm to allow him to move his forearm and move his fingers. And he has no ability to move his arm and fingers are very, very limited outside of this. And so this is another idea in brain-computer interfacing is what if we can go around the spinal cord that may have been severed and just reanimate those limbs directly from brain activity. I've just got a few more examples for us. I know we're running back to back through these, but this is from Neuralink playing a video game, playing Mario Kart. And I would guess that if you're watching this, it'd be pretty hard for you to tell which person is just using a normal controller and who is using the Neuralink implant. And the answer to that is the person on the right, who in this race managed to finish second, was the one using the implant. So pretty exceptional that we are already there, able to do complex tasks. And here's someone using the BlackRock array, Nathan Copeland playing Final Fantasy, which is a pretty complicated game if you're thinking about, we're trying to control this directly from thought. So again, it shows some of the power that this technology is capable of. And finally, with the implantable BCIs, I want to talk about a new technology that's coming out, which is direct speech encoding. So thinking of words that you want to say, again, for people with ALS that are unable to say them, and then just having that appear on the screen. So this is in real time. So the sentence on top, the participant is presented with, and they have to think that sentence. And you can see what we just saw there is this is the decoder decoding entirely from her thoughts that sentence. So she was cued by this so that we can detect accuracy, and this got it of 100% right there. And just so that you can see what this device looks like, this is called an ECOG array. Instead of going into the brain, it just sits right on top of it, and it gives us 128 electrodes. And instead of going to the hand areas of motor cortex, we're going to the throat, the tongue, mouth muscles, and we're looking for a unique signature that is created when you make every vowel sound. So it collects a tremendous amount of information when you ask the person to say various vowel sound or various phonetic sounds, and then it uses that to construct entire words. And this is pretty exceptional. It is at about 25% accuracy to get a sentence correct, which is not usable yet, but we're working with a word bank of 125,000 words, so that's pretty exceptional considering where we are. And when you limit it to a 50-word word bank, we're above 95% accuracy. Okay. There we go. Let me just get back into it. Great. So now we're going to be talking about non-invasive technology. So this is something that if any of you are interested in playing around with this on your own, this would be the route to go. I put up two devices on the right that are fairly accessible, only about $1,000 for this one here, and $1,200 for the G-Tech headset. So pretty accessible. You can do less with them, but this is a more accessible point for most people, and of course has the benefit of not requiring brain surgery. So we'll talk about a few mechanisms for how this works. I will show some examples of just like I did before, and then we'll start to talk about the implications of this for the future of technology. So we're looking at overall brain state. We cannot hone in on those motor signals like before. So there's something that we use called the surprise response, which in technical terms is called an event-related potential. And so if you're looking at this keyboard here and you want to type a letter, let's say that you want to type the letter H, you're going to look at that letter and you see that these rows and columns are flashing up. And when that letter lights up, your brain gets excited because something changed to the thing that you are interested in. And so we get data from that going across in the columns, and then we get data from that going across in the rows, and then you look for where that signal lines up, and you can see that there's a special signal right here. Where those line up, that letter is typed. And this is used in many applications, as I'll get into later, beyond just typing, but I think that this is a good example of that. And this is me in one of my YouTube videos using this to play Minecraft. I could aim the crossbow and then shoot the bow by programming various commands to the keys that are selected from this. The kids particularly like this when I will talk to like 6th graders. So another one is a light response. So we see lots of different letters that you might want to type. It's hard to tell in this GIF, but they are all flashing at different frequencies. And when you record from the back of the brain, which is our visual area, we can actually see the unique frequency of the device, of the the letter that you are looking at appear in that part of your brain. And so every 3 to 6 seconds, you can make a selection with above 85% accuracy. And this is something that there's plenty of open source software around. If you buy a headset, you could probably have this running in about an hour and a half. And finally, again, we're looking at overall brain state. And so we cannot get that very specific information, but we do see when, for example, someone is focused and really concentrating, we get this high frequency information up here. And then the more relaxed they are, the bigger amplitude we have, the lower frequency. And so you can use that to do simple linear control of objects. So imagining moving this drone up and down in the air. This person is able to actually levitate the drone. If you paired it with something like the light responses that we saw, you could fly it around as well. And then this person who is also paralyzed is using an exosuit based on focusing and imagining moving his legs forward that actually moves this exosuit forward. And this was done in, I think, 2011. So the technology has improved from that point. The last way that we measure brain activity that I want to mention is hedodynamic response recording schemes. And so basically what this is doing is it's recording oxygenation in your blood flow and energy in your blood flow. And so it's looking at what areas of your brain are recruiting the most energy. And that gives us a pretty good idea of if it's recruiting more energy, it's more activated, and based on what we know of what different regions do, we can hone in on what that person is thinking about and get some good insight there. And so we can do this through optical imaging, so we send light into the brain and look at it rebound, ultrasound through a similar mechanism, bouncing compression waves, sound waves into the brain, and then through magnetism as well with fMRI, which many of you may be familiar with. And there's one really, really cool example that I want to shout out for this that used, I believe, stable diffusion to create images based on brain activity that it was able to get. This is a really cool paper I recommend if you're interested in AI image generation that you check this out. So basically what they did is they put people in an MRI scanner, they presented them with a series of stock images and videos, and they looked at the brain activity that lit up. So in this example over here, we see a plane, we see the color gray, and the researchers would look for features and then match that up to brain activity. So say, when we see this brain activity, we know that they're looking at gray. And it would do this for, you can read in the paper, for thousands of different classifications that they could find. And then they fed that together, and so they did that in training, looking at the stock images. And then they turned off the connection of the algorithm, and then asked them to either imagine various objects, and they would try to construct that, or they would show them pictures and see what the decoder could figure out from their brain activity. And so here are some examples of that, and you can see that they're quite exceptional. So these images down here were constructed entirely from feeding information from that brain activity into the AI image generator, and these are the original images. So pretty amazing that we're able to do that already, an early form of mind reading, if you will. So we've talked about recording, reading from the brain. Now we want to talk about sending information into the brain, stimulating. And so there are various methods to do this as well, similar to the methods that we talked about before for recording from the brain. There is electrical stimulation, where you just inject current into the brain, stick an electrode in the area that you want, and that injected current will cause neurons to fire. You can do this as well with non-invasive electromagnetic coils. And you can do this with focused ultrasound as well, so just shaking the neurons causes them to fire. And then if you modify neurons with genes that make them sensitive to light, you can shine light on individual neurons and cause them to fire, which is pretty incredible. So there's a subset of the field of neurotechnology called neuromodulation. We also call them electroceuticals because they are technologies that try to repair or augment failures in the nervous system for medical benefit. So they're often used for, so this system that you can see over here is called a deep brain stimulator. There is a thick shank, it's about the size of a pencil, that is sent down into the middle of the brain, which is used to initiate movement. And in that area, with someone in Parkinson's, at least 80% of the neurons have died, and so they are not able to control their movement very well. Stimulating that area helps have a very significant improvement. They're also used for chronic pain. This device on the right, I was actually in a clinical trial in 2015 using this device. I used to have chronic migraines after a brain injury. I had 4 years of daily headaches and migraines. It took 4 years until I had my first day without a headache, actually. I'd tried over 3 dozen medications, ended up enrolling in this study using this device, and in 30 days, my headaches were cut in half. After a year and a half, they were completely gone. And basically what this is doing is it is looking at the specific neurons that are involved in pain processing, and it is just basically reprogramming them by stimulating at certain intensities that cause them to get out of their normal frequencies. It's also used for various psychiatric disorders like depression and anxiety, ADHD, and is being piloted in addiction. And these have actually been used quite widely. There are about 300,000 individuals worldwide that have a DBS electrode implanted in them, and a lot of these other technologies are coming down the line. So this brings us to looking at non-medical applications of this technology now. So we've talked about augmenting the nervous system, and so this brings us to the question of, well, if I have a healthy nervous system, can I still augment that to increase my cognitive abilities? And the answer is that you can, and there's been a lot of research in recent years that have been dedicated to this. And so a paper that I read the other day, which if anyone's interested in getting specific papers, you can send me an email. I'll give that to you at the end, and I can share all of these papers with you. There was a paper that came out recently that showed about a 15% increase in learning speed for people that just had simple current sent across their skull in a device with a setup similar like this. So you had 2 electrodes and you're passing current across those. Here's an image of that device as well. And so these have been used to increase memory, alertness, and have had improvements on general learning and cognition. And finally, in this category of sending information to the brain, we have sensory neuroprosthetics. So this is repairing a lost sense, such as hearing, vision, or touch. And so hearing, many of you are probably aware of cochlear implants. They're implanted in over 1.2 million people worldwide. And they connect to neurons in the ears that are not receiving signals because areas higher up have failed. And they can just send electrical signals that imitate what the incoming sound signals would be. There are also teams looking at stimulating directly into the brain. This area here that I'm circling with my cursor is related to our auditory processing, and so there's been some promising research of actually placing devices right there. In the visual system, there have been a couple approaches of putting arrays directly into the eyes. This has had the highest resolution that I've seen, with about 10,000 electrodes placed in there. So nowhere near the quality of vision that we have, but if you can imagine a screen with 10,000 pixels, pretty decent for someone that was blind before. When we go to the back of the brain, the resolution is a bit lower right now, but so the back of the brain is used for visual processing. But this is another potential approach that we'll see more development in the future. And so actually here's an example of what it looks like. An early version of this looks like. As you would probably imagine, you just have stimulation in a grid, just like you would have on a screen. And then that stimulation transfers into the retina, and that information is sent back. And it's pretty extraordinary. You can have someone that was blind their whole life, but their brain is still set up to receive this information. And within a few days of receiving stimulation, they start to be able to see symbols and make out letters like you see here. And then I mentioned earlier that Scott and several others are able to feel through their prosthetics. So this is an individual named Nathan Copeland, and back in 2014, he was the first person to receive stimulation in his somatosensory area. So that's, if you do your two fingers again, that's your pointer finger now is your area that does touch. And thankfully, that area mirrors the motor cortex, meaning that the area that you use to control your hand is very similar to the area through which you feel information, or you feel touch through your hand. And so here we're just seeing a researcher tapping the fingers of this prosthetic, and there's no audio, but Nathan is saying which finger is being touched. And all the way back then, he was able to do this at 95% accuracy. This has now gotten so advanced that that individuals can feel at up to 10 different points on the tips of each finger. So if we combine the recording and stimulation, we have closed-loop BCIs, which really is the future of this technology, and we're starting to get into the future of interfaces that use brain-computer interface technology. Because now we can use our brains to control the computer by reading that activity, and then that computer can send sensory information back to us. And so we can start to imagine what it would be like if we're using an interface and we're actually able to get a sense of a feeling around data, a vibe of the data based on sensory information that we're getting. And I will get to that a little bit more later, but I want you to just kind of be thinking about that right now. And of course, when you add stimulation to a computer-controlled task, it gets a lot more accurate. This is certainly true with prosthetics, because as we go around the world, like if I'm going to pick up an object, I can see my hand do this. I could probably do this without being able to feel it, but that certainly helps me understand where the object is and how much pressure to apply. And then finally, we have brain-to-brain interfaces, which I think is personally, I think this is the scariest of all of these, but they are starting to be developed, and there are some crude examples where they are working. So recently, in 2022, they were able to successfully implant rat memories from one rat to another. They hooked their brains up. And what they did is they hooked their brains up. They showed one rat a blue light and then shocked it, so an adverse stimulus that it didn't particularly like. And then they showed it a red light and gave it a treat. They connected their brains together, the learning areas of their brains, and then they did the same thing but without the shock stimulation and without the reward to the other mouse. And they found when that blue light was presented, the mouse got very scared, and when the red light was presented, it salivated, expecting a reward. So showing that there was transfer of memories between animals. And then in 2018, there was a human version of this using non-invasive technology and thankfully no shocks. So that was good. And basically what they did for this is they used the example of simple Tetris. So you have one person that is seeing the orientation of the shape over here. And our goal is to have this shape come down just like this so that these two prongs are facing up. And so one person can see the orientation of the shape, the other person can see the type of shape. And so they have this information. That information is being collected from their brains, and then it's sent to a third participant that is not looking at a screen. They're staring at a wall in front of them, and that image is actually projected into their brain using transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is the same technology that I used for my chronic migraines, just with some modifications. And then this image would actually be projected into their brain, and they were responsible for saying, oh, it needs to be rotated this way or that way, or oh, it needs to be moved over this many blocks. And you can see their accuracy levels over here that we're looking at about 75% accuracy, which is pretty amazing because we are just beaming things into people's brains. The fact that they can see that is extraordinary and a little scary. Okay, so I just want to briefly go over the industry. No, I'm not going to make you look at anything individually on this very overwhelming image, but the point is that this is a growing industry. So there are about 600 companies now. This image is actually a little outdated, even though it was in 2020. And if you go back to about 2010, we're looking at 50, 60 companies in that range. So this has grown quite significantly. It's expected to double its current size by 2030, which is really not that far away for the doubling of an industry. And right now, the industry is valued at about $60 billion. And big tech is starting to take notice. So Meta has invested quite heavily in actually some of the research that I've already shown you, but they're building their own devices. You can see over here on the left, and they're using this, they're hoping to use this with their VR systems. Apple recently came out with a patent to put EEG electrodes, so non-invasive brain sensing electrodes, into their AirPods, which we expect will come out within the next few years. That will probably be used for focus detection, and so if your focus wanes to something else, they may modulate what you're listening to either help you increase that focus or to lower the music if that's your goal, if you want to talk to someone. But there may be some basic control functions that come from that as well. Google is building a really interesting device that's combining both optical and electrical reading of the brain, and Microsoft has been doing a lot of research into auditory studies of the brain using brain-computer interfaces. So I just mentioned this because I know that all of you are obviously within the tech space, and whether it will be a neurotech company or one of these big tech companies or the many that are sure to follow, this is something that you will probably have to interface with within the next 10 years. And if not the devices directly, certainly the data, as it is tremendously sensitive, as I will talk about at the end. So I've shown you lots of back-to-back examples of what this technology is able to do right now. And if you're anything like me, even though I'm in this industry and I see these images all the time, I'm continually shocked and amazed at where the technology already is. It's crazy that we're able to do these things. But looking forward into the next 10, 15 years, of course, these technologies will continue to grow at exponential rates. And so I want us to start thinking about what a next generation user interface looks like when we are no longer using our bodies to type on a keyboard, to use a mouse, but we are actually interacting with computers and other pieces of technology directly with our brains. And it's a hard exercise to do. It's something I do very often and still usually end up getting a little bit stressed out and amazed by. So I give you this image. Thank you, ChatGPT, for the help earlier today generating this. But what I like about this is we're imagining computing in a very different way. So instead of sitting down at a desk all day and looking at that two-dimensional screen, which is not natural to our human state, right? We were evolved to walk around, to interact with objects in a multisensory way, to feel, to smell, to hear. And so this is just, it's not normal, and we know that sitting down for long periods of time every day is not healthy for us. And so what if we can imagine a different way with data that is more symbiotic with the ways that we go about the world? And so I provide this example here. I'm kind of imagining someone that is doing data analysis on social media. And let's imagine that instead of looking at numbers in a spreadsheet, you are walking through this 3D space where there are peaks and valleys representing activity in different sectors of that social media. And as you walk from sector to sector, you feel different emotional responses based on the types of conversations that are going on. It may feel hotter or colder in different areas. And maybe there are objects there, representations of what people are communicating that you can feel, that you can hear, that are closer to the actual object that that person is trying to represent. And it's a radical new way of thinking about what an interface can be. And I think it's very difficult to think about doing intellectual work, which we think of as sitting down at a desk and typing, to think about doing that work moving around, perhaps in a room that has objects that we are, physical objects that we're interacting with and digital ones. It's very difficult to imagine that, but I think that it is certainly a possibility. And so just going along that, imagine a radically different work environment with no desks, no physical computers, where intellectual work is conducted in an open space by interacting with physical and digital objects, and where AI is used to assist in decoding thoughts into words. Data can be felt, and entire thoughts can be transmitted through brains. And then finally, in this vein, I want to talk about intent-based interfaces, which I think are the hardest for us to imagine, because everything that we interact with, and this is both digital and physical today, requires the movement of our bodies, right? And so we have designed all of our interfaces to match that. But we don't necessarily need that movement in all aspects of how we are interacting with the world. So I imagine if I want to open up a program, there's no reason that I actually need to move a cursor over and click that or touch it with a touchscreen. It can just open. And what if we can make software that is very, very difficult to learn, something like, I use Photoshop quite a bit, and took years to know what all of the various buttons do and how they can be used. And I'm sure there are softwares that many of you have spent a long period of time learning, and that to use them effectively, you have to know what all of these little buttons do. What if you could just have a system that is able to know what you are trying to do and cut back on the amount of buttons that you have to interact with? Or what if instead of picking up a paintbrush tool within Photoshop, I could walk over and pick up an actual paintbrush or a digitized version of a paintbrush that I can feel, and then use that within a virtual space? So this is a very difficult thought experiment to do, to think about how to create an interface without movement. And even if we can adapt to those, but I think that it will be an important part of discovery for the future of interfaces. And finally, I've mentioned this a few times, but thought-to-thought transmission. If we go back to our initial exercise of imagining our first computers, our first experiences with technology, we all have different ideas of what that was. We all, of course, had different experiences. And if I want to tell you about mine, which was, I think, in 2006, 2007, my grandfather got me a computer. And I basically spent all of my time watching videos of robots playing soccer. That's what I liked to do. And I did that in my bedroom. And so I give you these details, and you can sort of imagine what that looks like. But of course, based on all of our experiences, you're all imagining different rooms. You're all imagining me younger a little bit differently. And there's a lot of information that's lost between that if I want to share the fullness of that experience with you. And so if I could send you a thought directly with emotion, with visual memories that I remember, then the speed of communication could be a lot higher. Okay, so a lot of this may seem a little bit scary to you. It is to me, certainly. I think there are many examples every day that I see of ways that this technology has improved people's lives, but I think that it could be extraordinarily dangerous as well. So the first and perhaps the most obvious are the physical risks. Brain surgery en masse across populations is a bit concerning. I like this meme over here on the right of, what if your Neuralink device has a bug, or any other brain implant device has a bug? We probably, we don't want that to be happening in our brains. If someone were to hack the device, that's particularly scary. If you get a computer virus, it sucks. You might lose your banking information, identity stolen. Those are all awful things. But we're talking about a very different scale between that and someone hacking your brain and sending too much voltage into the brain, or even being able to discern what you're thinking about. And so these are, of course, incredibly scary concerns of what could happen, and as you've seen, a little bit closer than I think we may like. And so this is one of the things that I think might be most relevant to you, which is neural data management and ownership. So on the legal side, currently there are no protections that say that you own your own neural data. And outside of medical devices, of which there are many, all of the devices being developed by the big tech companies and many others are not considered medical devices. Any non-medical device, that data is not protected by HIPAA. That company can own it. And so these are considerations that we have to make when we think about how companies have handled our data, our social media data, and thinking about what we might want to and might not want to turn over for our brain data. And of course, because neural data is so sensitive, we saw that it can be, that it could soon be our thoughts, what we imagine, our memories. It is really, really important, more now than ever, to make sure that we're developing very robust cybersecurity and data management systems. And so this is something that I hope that all of you are thinking about if you're ever interfacing with healthcare interfaces and healthcare systems, is just that this will become more and more critical over time. And so building solid foundations is so, so important as it will become increasingly critical. There's also the fuzzy issue of that the vast majority of BCI funding has come from DARPA and its contemporaries in Europe and China. Each one of them has contributed over $1 billion. The US is approaching $2 billion. And of course, there are happy, inspiring stories that the research produces on the surface. We see Jan over here, who I've had the pleasure of meeting. She's a wonderful person. And she was in one of the demos earlier that I showed. She's controlling a prosthetic and feeding herself chocolate in this photo. But this was DARPA-funded research, and one of the things that they wanted her to do was to fly a simulated F-22 fighter jet. And not only was she able to fly one of them, but she was able to fly 3 at the same time, simultaneously. And of course, she's paralyzed. She's not touching any controls, but she was able to fly them all around in various formations. And I know that they are working with her to do that in a simulated combat scenario. So interesting things to think about. And one of the things the US government has talked about with that is controlling AI assistant planes for a pilot that's flying, or other battlefield assets like drones, exoskeletons. This is a huge area of research. Brain-controlled exoskeletons to create super soldiers, and of course, the faster intuitive control of planes, like we've talked about. And even scarier, I would say, lie detection and interrogation equipment. Of course, if you can read what someone is thinking, that makes those things a little bit more, a little bit easier, even with of course, with a violation of privacy. And we do actually see this in society already. And I think that there's this is not all bad, there's a good ethical conversation to be had around personal autonomy versus public good. So this is a photo from the Shanghai-Beijing bullet train. It's the most traversed train every day in the world, with thousands of people that use this regularly. And in, I believe it was 2018, they piloted a program where they made all of their conductors wear brain-computer interface devices that were monitoring how alert they were and how focused they were on their job. And there's an argument to be made that that's a positive, because the thousands of people that are in this train are being kept safer, knowing that the person that is controlling the train is alert, is focused. But there's also, of course, a lack of autonomy that the conductors are facing, and they can be fired for bad brain data if they're coming to work too much with a lack of focus. And as someone with ADHD, this really scares me, because I would not score very well on this. But maybe I shouldn't be a train conductor anyway, so that's okay. And then taking it a step further, something that makes me a little bit more uneasy is this was a pilot study in China. The devices were actually made by a US-based company called BrainCo, based in Boston. And they ran a study with a little over 1,000 of these devices in classrooms, where this would detect the student's focus, and the teacher had a panel, and they could see how focused and how engaged each student was. And students could be reprimanded for nodding off. And this is something that faced a lot of uproar in the US and eventually in China as well. But this is something that parents actually voluntarily signed their children up for, as they thought it would give them a competitive edge. And so we see two things there. One, these are very complex issues with different cultural understandings, different cultural backgrounds that we have to be considerate of. But it also shows some concern about the pressures of competition. And if we have the ability to upgrade our brains and bodies, many people might feel forced to compete in academic and industry workplaces. And finally, not to point the finger entirely at China, in the US there are some researchers at UCSD and many other places that are working on lie detector tests and for potentially piloting in the judicial system. And this is actually not that hard based on those event-related potentials, those surprise response that I showed you earlier. This is something that I've piloted as well, just to see if I could do it. And basically what you do is you show someone people or an environment that they might be familiar with. And so in this case, this could be a crime scene. And you can show them lots of different environments and lots of different people, and you'll see who that person knows and what environments they're familiar with based on that surprise response. And so you can see pretty clearly, oh, this person knows the person that was killed, and this person has seen this crime scene before. And this brings up questions of, you know, we have the right to stay silent, but is our brain data, like, does our brain data classify as evidence, or should we be able to keep that to ourselves as well? And this does go into that question of autonomy versus public good, as it might be easier to convict criminals, but this does feel like a gross violation of personal autonomy. And then these last few here, I've touched on a little bit already, but social inequalities of this will become more and more evident. So, of course, if let's pretend we're talking just about cognitive enhancement devices. Let's say that there's a device that you could get that would make you 30% smarter. Of course, the wealthiest individuals will have access to this first, and that will make them actually physically smarter than other people. And of course, we know through history that humans have very regularly been awful to another group of humans, whether it's on racial lines or socioeconomic lines, and have said oh, they're not as smart as we are. And of course that isn't true. But we could start seeing a future where there are different classes, where there are people that are significantly more physically capable. And this is something to be concerned about, certainly. And then going off of that and the point before, we could also have situations where, knowing that other people are engaging in cognitive enhancement, it could make those of us that are less comfortable with this feel forced to partake in those activities and using those devices to compete in the workforce. And so, this would end up creating a cycle of upgrading the human body, and we don't know the long-term effects of these devices yet. And certainly this would pose some potential both physical and mental concerns. And it really gets at the core of questions of what does it mean to be human, and do we lose a human essence the more and more we integrate with technology? Or is our human essence to invent and to integrate with technology? These are big open questions. And so are we doing on time? Oh, we're right at time, perfect. So this is my last slide. I'm happy to take questions after, but I could just do that individually since we're at time. But I want to leave all of you with these questions that you can see up here, just to think about what your own answers are. So should BCIs be limited only to medical use cases? What harms and benefits to society could result from the widespread use of BCIs? Is there a use case scenario that would motivate you to use a BCI every day, via whether it's an implant or a non-invasive device? How will our relationship with technology be affected in the next 10 and 20 years by BCIs, or will it? and short and long-term problems that you might see that might arise for individuals with BCIs and societies with their widespread use. So I encourage you to think about those questions. I really enjoy getting to talk to people that are outside of the neurotech and neuroscience field, which is where most of my talks are, because these technologies will affect us all eventually, and I want as broad of a base of communication and conversation about this as possible. So I encourage all of you to think about these and take an active step in helping create the future that we all want and think is best. Thank you.